Hello and welcome to Get Yourself Optimized. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today it is my pleasure to have Natasha Todorovic-Cowan with us. Natasha is the CEO and co-founder of the National Values Center Consulting, which is the owner of the Spiral Dynamics brand. Whether your challenges are resistance to change, cultures in conflict, strategic partnerships, dysfunctional teams, or strategic change implementation, Natasha's experience includes unraveling the people side of organizational challenges from C-suite to shop floor using a proven human systems approach. Natasha, it's so great to have you on the show.
Stephan, it is awesome to be with you. How are you doing today?
I'm doing fabulous, and I am just so grateful. And I have had 3 interviews already. This is now my 4th interview of today, and I've got one more. I'm interviewing Jay Abraham a little bit later after we finish up. So it's a full day, but I'm so grateful to have you on the show and to have my listeners and YouTube subscribers. Yeah, it's all blessings.
Well, it's awesome to be here. So, what are we going to tackle today?
Well, I would love for our listener to understand, first of all, the spiral dynamics history or kind of origin story. And before we get into that, and then, of course, your origin story as well, before we get into that, I just want to give a little shout out to the spiral dynamics methodology, because I first got exposed to it through Tony Robbins and attending events like Unleash the Power Within and Date with Destiny, where not only did I have a explanation of it given, but I had some real world exercises that helped us really understand the implications of how we're kind of wired and how we think and what our values are. And it was really eye opening and very helpful. And so I remember Tony having these different people have different hats on of different colors, which match the spiral dynamics: the green and the yellow and the red and the orange and blue and all that, and what that means. And I loved it, and it always stuck with me. And so when we ended up meeting through a mastermind that we're both in, joint venture mastermind, JVMM, and it's like, I know I've got to have her on my show. So,
Oh,
well, thank you for being here. So do you want to maybe share your origin story and the origin of spiral dynamics?
yeah. Well, first, it's a treat and a delight. So, thank you for having me. And I love your interest, your enthusiasm, and this truly is an approach that, when you embrace it, can transform the way you see the entire world. And sometimes, when I've begun spiral dynamics certification trainings, I say to people, as a lighthearted joke, did you read the fine print? Right? And they're like looking. And I said, yeah, the fine print says you will never see the world the same way again. You'll never listen to music the same way again. You will never read the newspaper or listen to what's happening in the world in the same way again. Are you ready for this? Because it literally changes the way you see the world, the way you see yourself, and the way you see the interactions within the world. So I first came upon this approach not as spiral dynamics, but more as values in the world of NLP. I did a lot of NLP training, and this was presented as, quote, values. And I completed my MBA, and I was like, there was that values thing I did in NLP. Let me revisit it. And by the time I'd revisited it, this book had come out, and the book was Spiral Dynamics. And I picked it up and I started reading it, and I was like, that is nothing like what I learned. I need to pursue this more deeply, because I was looking at organizational change, and everything I read, to me, did not make sense. I mean, it made sense in kind of a casual way, but when it came to human change, both at an individual level, at a group systems level, at an organizational level, it didn't make sense, because it didn't really seem to touch what was actually transforming. So I read the book and I went, I need to take this course. I went to Texas. I drove and I took my 140-pound Russian wolfhound with me. And when we got to the Stockyards Hotel in Fort Worth, Texas, It was, kind of like an evening session to kick off the rest of the certification. And I had my dog, and I said to the presenter at the front of the room, I have a dog. I don't know, I want to make sure that he's cool all day, because it was Texas, mind you, it was January, but it was Texas. And he said, oh, bring your dog. I'm like, what? This is an amazing human being who says, just bring your dog to the room. And that happened to be Chris Cowan. He wrote the book. He actually wrote 90% of the book. Most people don't know that. And he was one of those people who was just open-hearted and generous and kind and truly a heart of gold. And he, because he was partners with his co-author, put him on the cover and, put him as first author because, he didn't need to be, quote, first author. And that just gives you a sense of his kindness and his generosity and his full-heartedness. So, funny thing, very little known fact. So before, and I normally don't do this, but before I went to Texas, I checked my horoscope for some reason. Mm-hmm. And the horoscope said, you're going to meet, your life partner. And I'm like, yeah, right. And then I got to the room and I looked around and I went, yeah, no, they're not going to be here. Then I set off and just did the work and brought my dog in every day, and it was kind of fun. During that program, Chris and I really deeply connected, and I was invited to become part of the organization. That kicked off a story of going to 15 different countries on 5 continents. We traveled nearly 2 million flyer miles and delivered certification around the world to thousands of people as they sought to understand human nature and change and differences and use of the spiral dynamics assessments. That's how all of that kicked off.
I love that story, and how the horoscope actually predicted that you'd meet him and you guys would fall in love and all that. That's really cool.
Well, those things are never right. It was a long time in my life.
Except when it really matters, then it's spot on, right? Beyond any kind of coincidence type of, it's not random chance. This stuff is completely, it's a rigged game that we're playing. Totally rigged.
You asked about the origins of the approach,
yes.
Which I think is really relevant, because I think people misinterpret this work and they project a lot into it. In fact, I often say that the spiral is the world's most amazing Rorschach test because people see in it what they want to see. But that begins with a professor at, in Schenectady, Union College, who was, because it was the war years, he was seeing his professors kind of come in and out. And because his professors were being drafted, they were just kind of pouring their hearts out. They didn't know if they'd ever come back. So the Rogerians would pour their heart out about, Carl Rogers' work. The Freudians would pour their hearts out about Freud. The Skinnerians would Skinner. And so when he started teaching, he sort of did a bit of a similar thing as to what he'd experienced. He'd teach Freud and Rogers and Skinner and Maslow and all of these guys. And at the end of the semester, his students would say, well, but Dr. Graves, which one is right? And at the time, there were numerous debates amongst psychologists. What is maturity? Because what the psychologists believed was if we can define maturity, then what we would be able to do is we would be able to grow mature people, train mature people. We'd have mature societies. And if we had mature societies, we'd no longer have war. So he set out with his students, who were kind of his guinea pigs, to have them define what maturity was. And the way he did that was, and it was not like our world today. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have anything. He just said to his students, don't read anything. Just write what you believe maturity is. And at the end of each semester, he would collect these. And then he'd get a group of what he called judges, and he'd put them in a room. And their task, and they had no idea what he was doing, and he didn't really either at the outset, but their task was to take these conceptions of maturity and to make order of them, to find patterns. And they had to come to consensus about what they saw as patterns. And inevitably, semester after semester after semester, he'd do this. And because he had some of these students over a longer period of time, over many years, he got to see them change and grow. And what the judges ended up finding in the patterning was they do these piles, this pile of people, and then this next pile of people, and this next pile of people. And then what Claire Graves would do in his classes was he would divide his students according to the piles and set them to do certain tasks. And from that, he'd observe, how did they organize? How did they work with one another? How did they set up the way they worked? How effective were they in the way they worked? And from that, he also did a battery of other psychological tests. And those piles became these very clear sort of, quote, clusters or categories of these human systems that you have come to know through the colors. The colors themselves were created by Chris. And so he and Graves would spend weekends together. He was at the Graves farm a lot. And all of the Graves material was given to us. It was entrusted to us. But, back to the, where did the colors come from and how, what's all the sort of the origin piece. In that 10-year period between, I think it was like 1976 to 1986, when Chris and Claire were working together and sort of exploring, and Chris would take him out to do lectures, and he'd visit the farm, and there's a lot of back and forth. Chris had these title slides, and he'd build the content for Claire Graves, and he kept dropping the title slides, and they were all like black and white slides, and he said there has to be a better way. And he took a paintbrush, and he called it, I think he said it was a Grumbacher number 8 paintbrush, and he just got the set of colors, and he's like, all right, I'll paint this. And the first one is going to be beige for the beginnings of our society, for the savanna grasslands, for survival in, sort of the African grasslands. And then purple. And purple, for him, the metaphor was the first dyes of royals that were created from bugs. And then the next one was red, that kind of fiery, expressive, sort of the ego for the first time emerging. And then the next one was blue, sky blue, heaven, all is right in the world, sort of metaphor. And then the next one was orange for the industrial age and the fires of the furnaces. And then the next one was green as he was painting these little slides. And that was inspired from, the book, The Greening of America, and more of that green movement. And yellow for solar, and the sort of that newer sort of technology that was emerging that was more environmentally conscious. And then finally turquoise, because what did the astronauts see from the moon? They saw this beautiful turquoise ball. And then he kind of sarcastically, some and tongue-in-cheek, and said, and then what did they see under the oceans would be the corals. So, coral. And then he just painted it. So then when the slides fell, he could put them back in order easily and quickly. So that's how the Spiral Dynamics trade dress and logo and name emerged, because it's spiral for human nature and dynamics for how we grow and change.
So when somebody is looking very kind of didactic and rules-based, highly predictable in their behaviors, and very kind of rigid because of their belief systems, you can say that person is blue.
Well, maybe. And and I'll elaborate on that, because I think one of the things that people really conflate in this approach is a couple of characteristics with something like brain dominance. Our brains, we do have people who can be very linear, very sequential, very process driven, very incremental in their thinking, and still be processing in more orange ways or green ways. And rigidity is something that starts kind of at the beginning of our spiral and loosens incrementally over these multiple systems.
Right.
So you're on target with the rigidity, but it's not kind of fixed to a system. You see the loosening over time.
Right. So somebody who's
So
red, which is earlier on in the spiral, and they're very egocentric and can be prone to blowing up and
yeah, so all that is all personality based, and that's,
okay.
kind of another misunderstanding.
Oh, good that we're
So
talking about this so we can clear that up.
well, it's the colors became these simple ways of trying to get people at just that very basic, the sort of popular level to start. Chris said, if we can get people to break out of, they're good people and they're bad people, and we're the good people and they're the bad people, to at least start thinking outside of that kind of duality to more kinds of people and what makes them different, then we've had a win. And I think now, with so many people having come to spiral dynamics, what we need to do is break people out of thinking about it as a typology. There are a lot of typologies, and typologies are awesome because they help us to see in more nuanced ways personality. Understanding personality, the Myers-Briggs and the DISC, we have become very sophisticated as a society in terms of our ability to embrace differences in this way. But that typological thinking is also carried into spiral dynamics. So when people come into a program, now it used to be we introduce them to this, and now we have to kind of do a different thing, which is change and transform the mindset of this typological thought. Because truly, when we see another human being, we have a cognitive bias. And within a tenth of a second, we immediately decide, is that person attractive? Is that person trustworthy? Is that person competent? And these are things we can't really, some of them we've got taste in terms of, attractiveness, but some of it we have no business deciding, but that's how our brains are built, and that's where our typological thinking comes from. So once we get into that kind of a shift in terms of how we're thinking, we can then begin to understand more deeply these as systems. And these are relationship systems. And the terminology that we use is they are dominated by, right? And most of my advanced students don't even use colors. The colors are handy to start getting that foothold on this very slippery mountain of understanding human nature. So back to red.
Mm-hmm.
So if we are looking at someone who's dominated, and we'd say dominated by P coping, which is the thinking that matches the C world, right? So we have to have C world with P coping. When those come together, then we can say we have red. So the C world is unpredictable. The C world is often dominated by might makes right. Because you don't know what happens next, you have to cope with this world, right? So imagine, there are a lot of shows now about the Vikings and how they'd come in and they'd conquer and they'd take slaves and all of that. Well, if you had to live in that kind of a world, How do you survive? How do you have to think? How do you need to behave? How do you need to shift so that you can live in a successful way in that world? And in that world, P thinking would match, which means you have to be stronger, which means you have to be in some ways instinctively driven. You have to have certain prowess. That's the age when humans created farming and dominated the planet. So it's much more than, it's an angry person. Well, anger happens in all our systems because it's part of humanness. It tells us when our boundaries have been violated. So we can't just say, red is angry, because all the systems do anger. And it's how do we think about the anger? How do we process the anger? How do we behave when anger happens?
Right.
And with our red, it is a system that doesn't have a sense of future. So if you don't have a sense of future and you don't have restraint and you have an angry person, that is going to express differently than if you have no sense of future, you don't have restraint, and you happen to be a kind and loving person. And both can still be dominated by this red world, red system, red relating, and red worldview. So I hope that's helpful and interesting.
Yeah, that's great. That really clarifies it, because what I remember now from the Tony Robbins event, where he had these people put on different hats and basically take on the worldview of that system represented by the hat color. Person with the red baseball cap would have to argue their point in a red sort of way. And I was thinking this is really about them being kind of hot-headed and quick to anger and so forth. But no, it's about having a worldview that there are no consequences for one's actions.
And there are no consequences, not because they're saying, I don't want to look at consequences. There are no consequences because they don't have the neurology and the processing and the thinking to see a timeline. In fact, I remember having someone on one of our programs who just fallen behind. And really nice guy, different region of the world. And what we sat down to do was to figure out a timeline for how this person was going to catch up. And I said, what are the things that you're going to do? How are you going to lay them out? What are you going to do first? What are you going to do next? What are you going to do? You put in place your approach, your strategy for catching up. And he simply couldn't do that. He couldn't put together a project plan. I think he approached it with shame, right? That he couldn't do those pieces. There was no exploding, there was no anger, but that just gives us a different view of what the system is. Because if you have someone who does not work on punishment, who does not work on consequence, who does not see future, you're going to have to work with them very differently than somebody who does. And then to your other point, in terms of worldviews and putting ourselves in them, what we've discovered and learned over time is we can teach some of this, but understanding and being actually able to put yourself in their shoes, from their eyes, from their heart, from their wiring, is very difficult for probably 90 some odd percent of the people. So when we have seen how people, quote, labeled, 99% of the time, the color that they pick for the thing that they see is off. And that's because it goes back to our typological thinking. And the beauty of this truly is, if we want to see from another's perspective, from another's worldview, to understand their mindset, we do need to be able to construct in a usable way a understanding of what the actual psychology is. Not what we want it to be, not what we think it is, not what we like or dislike, but what it actually is like to be in that mind, what it is actually to be like in that world, in that social system, what it is actually like to be confronting the problems of existence that that individual or group are confronting, and then what it is to be in the story that they tell themselves or share as a group or community that creates culture. So it's not, it's not as easy as putting on a few hats and going, this is what I pretend it'll be.
Yeah. Well, it's like you're trying to not just understand a worldview and a system thinking approach that isn't yours, but you have to almost go back in time or back into like a previous version of yourself, maybe that was in that stage of existence to kind of get that world. It reminds me of Plato's cave allegory. You know about
Yeah. Yep.
the cave?
Yep. Yeah. I've used it exactly like that. Go ahead. Share. Share. For those who haven't heard
Yeah.
it.
Well, why don't you explain it? Because I'm sure you've done it many more times than I have. So explain the
Well,
Plato's cave allegory.
so and it's been a while, but we're in the cave, and we're kind of looking at the dancing shadows, right? But we don't really see the dancing shadows and who is making those shadows. And once we're in the cave, and we're kind of our eyes are accustomed to that dark. Stepping out of the cave is very bright, and it's very hard to see in that new world. But it's also that piece of not seeing the shadows, right? Or what creates the shadows, because they're in the dark. And in a sense, when we are processing from wherever we're processing, when we're we live in our own brains, we live in our own bodies, we live in our own neurology, right? So that's what we're used to. And we're still coming to understand self, right? So it's hard enough to figure oneself out, to step out of that and leave self behind sufficiently so as to step into another's world isn't as easy as it sounds. It's easy for us to care about and empathize when someone has had an experience we can relate to. But a friend of mine just told me this story about Thanksgiving, right? Where, I think it was her sister-in-law came over and says, how can you not be stressed by all of this? There are 18 people in the house and people were all doing their things. And the difference was her sister-in-law, whatever, when she set out a table for 18 people, all of the cutlery matched, all the silverware matched, all of the plates matched. It was perfectly set up like a magazine. And, in her house, it was like, grab what you want, enjoy, hang out where you want. We've got no set time for everything. You're hungry, go eat. The food's over there. Oh, you need that? Find it over there. So people found it really comfortable, right? Very different ways of approaching, dinner, Thanksgiving dinner.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the one couldn't really understand the other. Right. But my friend understood her sister-in-law. Right. But the sister-in-law couldn't understand her. Right. So we have these kind of interesting ways and means of reaching out, maybe touching the shadow, but finding that we're touching the wall instead of the human that we'd like to embody for a time to understand.
So that the part of the Plato's cave allegory is that the people in the cave are chained to the wall and they can't leave. So they have no other way to experience the world other than to watch the shadow plays against the wall that are being conducted by the people who are casting the shadows. And so if someone manages to break free, see the world for what it is, and then come back and tell the people who are still chained up, you wouldn't believe what life is really like. They actually wouldn't believe it.
Totally blanked on the chaining, you see? I don't like that, so I blanked on it.
Yeah, so we are constrained or restricted in some sense in that we are very
Yeah.
dense, heavy, material based humans instead of being we are energy beings, but that's not our experience of life. So in a way, we are chained to the wall
Mm.
in the cave, and we don't experience what it's like to be a fifth dimensional or higher dimensional being. We get to experience people yelling at us on the freeway because we're trying to get over and they're not letting us or whatever,
Mhm.
right? So
Well, totally right. If we're not able to experience the freedom of being non-physical, how are we even going to step into the reality of another's physicality that's not ours when the only physicality we know is our own?
yeah.
And that is this work. But I completely forgot about the chaining. I don't like that. I'm going to delete that again.
That is called selective memory.
It is. You see, it is. We do it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's funny. Okay, so how do you, in your day to day life, get more relatable to somebody who has a completely different worldview and has a different system to you? What
Hmm.
are you doing on a day to day basis to stretch outside of your system?
Yeah. It isn't easy. And my recommendation is do it when you have the most patience, particularly when it's a system that you don't like. But I think the first piece is abandon self. And that takes an act of courage because you have to be comfortable enough with self and to know yourself to be willing to, quote, abandon yourself, right? Because you can't really bring self in because self comes with judgment, self comes with expectation, self comes with, well, but that's weird, right? So, in a sense, you're letting yourself go to be fully present with this other person. And then the other piece of it is what I teach our clients to do is to begin to put together their experience, right? And what does that entail? That entails kind of a historical view of what made them who they are. That entails understanding their beliefs and values. That entails having a solid feel for what their world has been like. That entails being able to be present and listen to the affective, emotional experience of what it's like being them, of reflecting back who they are to help them articulate more around what's going on for them. Because much as we have language, we still don't have great language for some of the things that are going on within that are more kind of complex feelings and reactions and interactions within self as self interacts with the world and with others. And then we're also looking at what's happening in the relating. How are people treating them? How have they treated people? Do they see what's actually going on? Are they putting stories on it? So we're really trying to be fully present to notice how that individual is operating in their world and what their world and that relationship system of which they're a part is like for them.
So, what would our listener who is maybe somewhat familiar with Myers Briggs or with DISC or one of these other assessments, how would they put spiral dynamics into practice without having to read an entire book or take an entire workshop or course? Like, what are some practical things they could do today that would get them
Mm-hmm.
some more relatability and more loving kindness and understanding in their interactions with others?
I think that's a great question, and we use models to help us as a vehicle to guide us through. So it's kind of like we're taking a ride in Disneyland on one of the trains that takes us through. I forget what the things are, right? So number one is your reality is your reality, and that's not necessarily someone else's reality. So you have to ask yourself, do you really want to understand what's going on with them? In which case, put yourself aside. But if you're not ready, then be present with the not being ready. Be fully authentic and transparent about, this is me, this is who I am, this is what I need. Because it takes effort and energy to get into another's mind brain world.
Yeah.
Most of the conversation we have is at a surface level of chit chat. And very rarely do we have conversations that take us really deep into the inner beings of that other person. And that takes skill and that takes expertise. The easiest and hardest thing to do simultaneously is to be fully present and to listen without putting yourself into the situation, and then reflect back what their experience is. And if you've got it right, they'll tell you. And if you don't, try again. And from your question, which is more of a practitioner's question, how do you layer these different tools? It goes back to our earlier conversation that an introvert in red is going to show up differently than an extrovert in red, but they still have a red world that they need to cope with and red processing that dominates their decision making. Someone who is meticulous is going to show up differently, whether it's red or orange or green or whatever, than someone who's just let it go. Like in my example of the turkey dinner, right? One is just really detailed, meticulous. Everything has to be right. The other one is like, let it go. They can both be, let's say, red, right? But it's going to show up differently. And so be cautious about personality and processing from a psychosocial developmental perspective, being these different things. And we are very multi-layered, multi-dimensional, complex beings. See others in the same dimensionality you hope they see you with. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's good. Yes, that does. And, it reminds me of a quote that I hear every so often. I think it's attributed to Eleanor Roosevelt, and that's great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people. So if you really want to get into somebody's world and make them feel understood, because it doesn't matter, it doesn't count if you understand them or you get them. It only counts if they feel gotten by you. Learned that from Ephraim Olszewski, and who's a past guest on this episode, and I attended his workshop, and that was a really profound thing to learn. It doesn't count unless they feel gotten by you. Totally understand them and like, wow, I totally get it. And then they're like, no, I don't feel it.
Yeah, and that someone cared enough to put out that effort.
Yeah, it starts with the effort. And I think it's really important to, as you said, connect with yourself and be real with yourself. And if you're not ready to understand that person's worldview or perspective on things because you're depleted or you're still angry about it or whatever, take a break and get to a place of equilibrium and then try again, rather than try and push it and lie to yourself that I'm gonna be fine. I am fine when you're not. That's the last person that you want to lie to, is yourself.
Yeah, well, and it's also, are we understanding their perspective? Are we understanding their intent? Are we understanding their emotional state? Are we trying to understand their experience? What is the thing we're trying to understand? And we can do a whole lot in that region and area without ever having to go into the depths of psychosocial development. But for those who are transformationally oriented, for those who have done a lot of the MBTI and the DISC and the Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram and all of that, and who are saying, there's more, and I want to get beyond the typologies. What does it look like? Then you're taking a journey into the kind of stuff that we do. But there's so much you can do without ever having to done all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, that piece, what are you trying to understand about the other? What is the other trying to express about what they want you to understand.
Is there someone that really sticks out in your mind as a public figure who really does go beyond the typology and understands in this deeper way what makes people tick?
And not that people would recognize.
Well, who's somebody that they wouldn't recognize?
Somebody that they wouldn't recognize. Well, some of the people that are in our programs, that are doing coaching or that are working organizationally to help leaders to cohere more effectively with their teams or to get them moving along. But it's not a lot, Stephan. It really, truly isn't a lot. We have a bias, I think. I'm human. I get other humans. What's not to get? They like chocolate ice cream. I like vanilla ice cream. That's the extent of how we see differences. Oh, I don't know, they're a quick start and I'm a fact finder, right? Okay, now we got it. Now we can move on. But we are so much more layered and intricate and interesting than that.
Yep.
Most of us, not all of us, most of us.
Well, there's got to be an example company that you look at and like, okay, these guys really get it. And they've implemented it in a way that the workforce feel that.
Oh yeah, I mean we've got pockets. You're asking for
Okay.
stories. I'll share a story with you. One of our clients who was working with the Dutch police ended up. I think uh, I don't get the ranks and everything right, so just go with me. So he was commander, I think, of a unit that was at a protest in the Netherlands. And there were rocks being thrown and there was, sticks and violence and this and that. And his team was coming up to hold the line. And he said to his team, all right, now what I want you to do is I want you to lift up your helmets and I want you to put your hands out and I want you to introduce yourselves to those people right in front of you. That was a moment of courage, vulnerability, and trust, because moments before everyone was lined up and kind of beating each other and shoving and pushing and that, and they very reticently did what they were ordered to do. Mind you, he had done a read of the situation. He understood our approach. He understood who this group was. So he was able to have them take that risk. And immediately the tensions dropped and they were having conversations with real humans and the violence stopped. And I did a presentation to the police officers group here in California at one point, and I shared that story. And the way they saw it was they greeted it with revulsion and fear, because their reaction immediately was, that's officer endangerment. And the point being, if you know and can understand and can accurately figure out what's happening on the other side, you can make a call that goes against protocol, that goes against instinct, that goes against everything you have learned to be the right call for those people in that situation.
Right. And to do the opposite and just go with your instinct, or I'd say no more like your reactiveness or reactivity, could have ended in somebody dying.
And which happens, right? It happens. Really great bunch of people. They're working with at-risk kids in Australia. And, these are kids who were kicked out of every program, some kicked out of reform school. But what they did was they put a program together and they were able to get the kids to differentiate. For example, we went and we visited with them and we did sort of a kind of a treasure hunt with the kids. And the kids were sort of doing a bit of a, spiral dynamics-y treasure hunt. And they got to a place where the firefighters were spraying water and they were doing stuff. And some of the boys were like, Oh, the fireys, they're good blue. The coppers, we hate them. They're bad blue. But the fireys, they're good blue. So, just that differentiation between, who's showing up and how are they showing up. And these guys would tell the kids, look, what your teachers want is for you to sit down, shut up, learn something, take notes, succeed on the test. And they're like, no, 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 no. Those teachers, they hate us, or they're jealous, or they just want to like push me down. And they're like, no, no, no. These teachers want you to sit down, shut up, take notes, do well in class. And then eventually they're like, wait, you mean to tell me all these teachers want is for me to sit down, shut up, take notes, and do a good test? It's like, yeah. Oh, well, we can do that. Right? So it's the misinterpretation of signaling coming from another person and what it means to
We're great meaning
me.
makers. We will make all sorts of crazy stuff up from some observation.
They're just out to get me. No, I want you to
how
learn.
does this apply to listening to music? Because you, at the beginning of this conversation, mentioned a couple of things like, it changes how you'll never listen to music the same way again. You'll never read the news the same way again once you've taken on board this new approach, this new methodology. How does listening to music change once you understand it?
Well, you're going to interpret the lyrics differently. You're going to see different meaning in it. You're going to hear different things and make obviously different meaning from the sounds and the types and forms of music that you listen to.
We don't have time to really go into this, but I'm just curious, in a 30-second answer, does your training in NLP and neuro-linguistic programming change spiral dynamics, or are they two completely separate things? Are you somehow weaving these two modalities or methodologies together?
Right. And so it's been a very long time since I've done my training. So the way I would answer that question is in the way I facilitate and train. It's whatever stuck, whatever remains. But I did do an article that I'm happy to share about the principles behind spiral dynamics in NLP and
great.
where they come
Yeah,
together.
I'll include that in the show notes. Yeah.
Oh yeah, happy to share that. When I work with people, it can't not come in, but it's been a very long time since I've done it. And, I generally tell people I'm not a coach because I haven't been trained, although there's that, coaching school where it's like NLP and coaching, kind of combined. But no, when I came to this work, to learn completely and fully what Chris was doing with it, what Claire Graves was doing with it. And I've been accused of being a purist, but one of my earlier careers was in fashion. And one of my teachers who taught, haute couture said to me, copy. You need to copy first. You need to learn the rules. Make sure you know the approaches. When you are well versed in all the steps, then you can create.
A similar way of putting it is adopt before you adapt.
And I knew when I came to this work that I needed to embrace it completely and fully for what it was. And the innovation that comes in is when I'm helping our clients to work with their clients, or when I'm designing an approach for our clients that's rooted in psychosocial developmental systems.
Well, I know we're out of time. So if our listener is interested in getting training, certification, just learning the spiral dynamics methodology, working with your team, where should we send them?
If you're curious about the spiral dynamics journey that is right for you, we've got a quiz at the top of the opening page of our website, which is spiraldynamics.org, spiraldynamics.com, both. Just take the quiz at the top. It will tell you your next steps and supply you with all kinds of goodies.
And I'll include that link in the show notes as well. Awesome. Well, thank you, Natasha. This was fabulous, and doing such great things to keep spiral dynamics out there in the world and improving people's lives and helping them be more relatable and relating better. And yeah, keep up the great work.
Well, Stephan, has been a treat, an honor, a pleasure, and I thank you for giving me a space to share this amazing stuff with your audience.
Thank you. And thank you, listener. We'll catch you on the next episode. In the meantime, have a fantastic week. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.